Here's a number that surprises people. In France, a company can spend close to €2 for every €1 that actually lands in the employee's pocket. Same work, completely different math from the US. So why is it faster and cheaper upfront to hire in the US than in France? And what does any of that have to do with the decision France made back in 1945? That's where we're headed today. You're listening to Crossing the Atlantic, the podcast on how history shapes culture and how culture shapes business between the U.S. and Europe. I'm Christina Rebuffet-Broadus, and I'm sharing with you the lessons I've learned from 20 years of transatlantic business and hundreds of companies worked with, so you can avoid the six-figure mistakes that most companies only learn the hard way. Welcome back. Now, we're talking about pay and hiring in this episode, and I want to tell you a little story that happened to an American friend of mine back when I was teaching at the university in Grenoble. So this is way back in the day. So anyway, my friend got hired. He got his first paycheck at the end of the month. And now in the US, if you don't know, you usually get your paycheck every week or every 2 weeks, not every month. So it's the end of the month. My American friend gets his paycheck. He budgets accordingly, and he goes and spends most of it in about 2 weeks. And when he started looking forward to his next fortnightly pay, well, nothing came. Because in France, you get paid once a month at the end of the month. And he was like, oh shit, you mean I have to make this last all month? Now, yes, maybe he could have done the math or, remembered that, that what they told him when they hired him. I'm sure that they told him what salary he was going to be making. I doubt that they told him that that paycheck was going to be the entire month or that he was paid once a month. And for him, he didn't even think to question it because, when you've spent 20 or 30 years of your career where the normal thing is like a weekly paycheck or a 2-week paycheck, you don't even think to question that it might work differently somewhere else. And when you've spent your entire career hiring people who know that they'll get paid once a month, you don't think to point out that obvious little fact either. So no one's at fault here. But it's just one example of a little bit of a cultural difference. And now it's kind of a harmless example, in reality. My friend had an awkward 2 weeks eating pasta while he waited for his next paycheck, swallowing his hard-earned lesson with a slop of pesto, but nothing catastrophic. Now, let's walk over to the other side of that hiring desk, though. Imagine you're the company doing the hiring. Maybe you're a French company that has expanded into the US. You've grown and now you're making your first hires. Or if we're going the other way around, you're an American company landing in France and you're building your local team. Now, as a rough comparison, France tends to fold several jobs into one person, while the US splits the work across several people, each with their own dedicated role. Now, this isn't like a hard figure or anything. So, don't go and do the math and tell me, you can tell me that I'm wrong, that I'm always open to criticism. But this is not like hard, solid figures, but just roughly we could say that where the US hires 3 people, France hires 1 and combines the roles. And we'll get into why later, but it is part of why it's faster to hire in the US than in France. Now, let's look at why French companies hire fewer people and then ask them to wear more hats, if we can say. In France, hiring someone comes with costs, and those costs run high. Here's some numbers. 46.8%. That's the share of total employer cost that goes to taxes, social charges, income tax, plus employee and employer contributions as of 2023. So when a French company hires someone, nearly half the cost of that hire is taxes and social charges. 35%, that is the OECD average. 30% is the US average. So what does this mean exactly? Let's break it down and do a little bit of a comparison here. I'm going to be throwing a lot of numbers at you, so listen closely. The median gross salary in France is 34,000 euros per year for a take-home salary of roughly 26,000 euros per year. So the employee gets 26K, but the employer shells out a grand total of around 49,000. So it's almost like €1 goes to the worker and €1 goes to the state. Now, let's run the same figures for the US. The median full-time salary is $60,000 a year. Total employer cost is $65,000. The worker keeps roughly $48,000. So US payroll taxes only add around 9% on top versus that 42 to 45% in France. So where a French company spends close to €1 on the state for every euro that the worker keeps, an American company spends about $1 on taxes for every 3 that the worker takes home. Now, there's one other little nuance here is that U.S. employers usually pay for health insurance on top, and that can be, about $7,500 a year per worker. And in France, that health insurance, health coverage is already kind of baked into those social charges because it's the French social security system, which is very different from the American concept of social security. So all in all, it costs more to hire an American because salaries are higher, but U.S. companies, they pay less in taxes and charges proportionally. So it's going to cost the company less in terms of percentage to hire someone in the US compared to what it's costing in terms of, if we're looking at it proportionally compared to hiring someone in France. So, going back to France here, if you can get one person to cover several roles, then let's just say you get more bang for your buck, if we can say it that way. So there's also a second reason why French companies hire slowly. They're more cautious about hiring, and they hire fewer people. It's about how hard it is to let someone go. So in France, the standard contract, the what they call a CDI, it's basically like a permanent contract. It means it has an indeterminate duration. And once it's signed, letting someone go is pretty dang hard and pretty dang expensive. So companies hire cautiously and they hire slowly. Now, in the US, most work is at will. There's exceptions, but on a general scale, most of it's at will. It means you can let someone go anytime. So you can also hire freely and fast because you can let them go pretty much just as fast if necessary. And that makes the American market more dynamic, but it leaves workers with far less protection. And even, like I said, even that varies state to state because what flies in Florida can totally get you nixed in New York. It's going to come down to what are the laws in that state, and it really varies from state to state. It's why I always say that the U.S. is, we talk about the American market. It's really like 50 American markets. Anyway, between these two systems of what's happening in France and the US, I'm sure that there's some kind of happy balance somewhere in the middle. But for now, it is what it is. Quick little aside before we get into some of the history behind why this is the way it is. If hiring someone is part of a bigger move that you're making or you're thinking about making into a new market, whether you're an American company expanding into Europe or a European company expanding into the US, getting that whole expansion process right is what I do with companies. So there's a link in the show notes to book a short call with me. And if you also need boots on the ground for hiring itself, then I can also point you to the right people for that. So I'll put the link in the show notes And if you want to talk about your project of transatlantic expansion, I will be happy to do so. Now, the question that I had, even after 22 years of living here in France is, why are these systems so different? And it would be too easy and incorrect to say, because France is socialist and the US is capitalist. So let's dig into the history of why these systems are so different and also just kind of fix that very broad generalization, let's say. Anyway, let's go back. It's 1945. France has been through 2 hellish wars in the space of 30 years. And the government set out to build a complete social security plan to protect its people. Because when life hits you with illness, unemployment, old age, war, who absorbs the blow? France's answer was, we all do. Together. Everyone chips in when they can and everyone draws out when they need to. So in 1946, France wrote a new constitution for its Fourth Republic. And by the way, today, France is in its Fifth Republic, just so you know. Anyway, that Fourth Republic constitution, it included the universal right to health care, unemployment benefits, and pensions. So France isn't a socialist economy. It's a capitalist market economy that runs a large solidarity-based welfare state. Now, over on the other side of the U.S., employer-based health insurance it's a bit of an accident of history, actually, because back in 1942, we're still back in the thick of the war, and the War Labor Board froze wages to stabilize the job market and to help control inflation. But they left health benefits out of that wage freeze. So employers couldn't raise pay, but they could sweeten the package with generous health benefits. And by 1954, the tax code made those health benefits tax-free. So what started as a kind of wartime workaround just became the way that labor and healthcare work in the U.S. And that's why decades later in the U.S., your job carries the burden, or your employer carries the burden of your health care and not the government. So it comes down to 2 different visions of society and the question of who absorbs the blow when life knocks you down. Is it the state or is it you and your job, you and your employer? Are we all in this together, or are you the main person responsible for you? And the answer to that question decides how much labor gets taxed into the common pool and how much a worker takes home in order to, for lack of a better expression, fend for themselves. So, in short, either the state takes a bigger slice of what labor costs to fund healthcare, unemployment, and pensions for everyone, or it decides that that's mostly on the individual and the company, and it takes out less in taxes. France buys security and redistribution for the whole of society. I mean, ideally, at least. And the U.S. buys flexibility, speed, and more wealth staying in workers' and employers' pockets. So, yes, security and solidarity come with a cost, and that's why French companies hire fewer people than their American counterparts, because they are paying much more into this communal, social pot, let's say. So, if you're an American company hiring in France, here's something that can be useful for you to know in terms of language, because we know that, culture influences language, language influences culture, and all of that. In France, we talk about people who are couteau suisse. This means a Swiss Army knife. It's, one tool that can cut, unscrew, saw things, open a wine bottle, open a can of beans. I mean, you get the point. So we have these people we'll call them Swiss Army knives because they can do a little bit of all of those things. Well, not those things specifically, but they can do several different jobs. We also talk about in French, the mouton à cinq pattes. This means, the five-legged sheep, meaning you're hunting for something that it doesn't really exist and it's a little bit unnatural, like a five-legged sheep, or like a marketer who also runs your sales, manages your Google ads, translates your documents, does graphic design, and takes customer service calls. So if you're hiring in France, don't expect US hire and fire speed, and don't expect maybe to hire so many people for individual specialized roles. Now, in terms of the time it takes for hiring, it takes longer because you have to be sure of your choice. You're buying a more permanent relationship, and your new hire will probably need to wear a few different hats so that you don't bloat your payroll and sink your bottom line. And if you're a French company hiring in the US, you can expect much more fragmentation than what you're used to. Speed. People are hired and fired at a much faster rate, and there's much more specialization in terms of who does what role in the company. And importing that sort of one person wears three hats or four hats or five hats, importing that kind of model is rarely the right move when you're hiring in the US market. So, on one side of the Atlantic, you hire for versatility, stability, and long-term planning. On the other side, you hire for specialization, flexibility, and the agility to adapt as the market shifts. So that's it for this episode. Every other week, my newsletter, also called Crossing the Atlantic, breaks down how business really gets done on the other side of the Atlantic, so you can spot the costly mistakes before they cost you a deal. The sign-up link is in the show notes. Thank you for listening. I'm Christina Rebuffet-Broadus, and I'll see you next time on Crossing the Atlantic.